History comes to London to see Mrs. Thatcher. Olivia Todd now reports on the first 100 Mitterand days and what has happened to France since he took over in May from the defeated Giscard d'Estaing.
Et dans ces temps difficiles, où le mal rôde et frappe dans le monde, je souhaite que la Providence veille sur la France, pour son bonheur, pour son bien et pour sa grandeur. Au revoir.
Le Conseil constitutionnel a donc eu l'honneur de proclamer votre élection à la présidence de la République.
The atmosphere was one of jubilation. In fact, I had been to the Élysée several times, but I felt I was sort of taking possession. And also it was very amusing because the crowd was very different. There was a crowd of all the new socialists, and then what we call the corps constitué, that is all the authorities. And obviously their faces, their expression was so very different. It was very, very interesting. Some were grave, and we really couldn't keep back our joy.
With Pierre Mauroy, his newly chosen Prime Minister,
j'y étais quand même préparé. Je savais que ça se passait comme ça. Et j'avais eu 11 jours.
After all, I was ready for it. And there'd been 11 days between the day of my election and the inauguration ceremonies. So the surprise had had time to wear off. All the same, standing up there in an open car with this enormous crowd, which had, I think, a special quality about it because of the nature of my election, it was a tremendously cheerful and lively crowd. As we drove towards the Arc de Triomphe, I had a sort of feeling of harmony. Let's not get carried away, but it was a feeling of union with a whole people. And it really was the people there that day.
Not all the people were as pleased as the president. After all, 48% had voted for his opponent.
We were not pleased because the election of François Mitterrand opened a new era in French history that for us is not an era of progress and of liberty, you know. And we are afraid of the consequences of the Mitterrand election.
Mitterrand had dissolved the National Assembly, so in June the French weathered another election. Mauroy now led the elated socialists into battle, and the Prime Minister obviously enjoyed his own optimistic, old-fashioned rhetoric.
Que je vienne à Châlons, que je sois à Dreux, que je sois à Lille, que je sois à Paris, que je sois à Strasbourg, que je sois à Brest, partout les Françaises et les Français sont joyeux. La gauche est joyeuse, on le sait depuis le 10 mai. La droite est triste et je ne comprends pas comment on a supporté leur tristesse pendant 23 ans.
Ce qui va se produire si la majorité...
Giscard had evaporated. The conservative opposition was almost leaderless. Gaullist young Turks popped up everywhere. They asserted that socialists were going to wipe out all freedoms.
C'est-à-dire ce qui va se produire, la mise en cause d'un certain nombre de nos libertés essentielles, le bouleversement de nos conditions de vie.
For Toubon and his audience, socialists aren't social democrats. They're revolutionaries dedicated to theological Marxism and workers' control.
Véritable changement de société.
Élisez un député socialiste dans le 15e.
Giscard had melodramatically predicted chaos. The parliamentary elections were peaceful. With or without the presence of TV cameras, nobody was killed during street confrontations.
Bah écoutez, on verra ça la semaine prochaine, on verra ça la semaine prochaine.
Écoutez, les 30% qui ont voté pour vous et les 42% qui ont voté pour moi, c'était des électeurs qui ont démocratiquement exprimé, qui me préféraient moi que vous.
Mais bien sûr, le vote a eu lieu démocratiquement.
Alors, dans la 19e circonscription, prenez-en ce que vous en avez 30%, j'en ai 42, vous en aurez 40, j'en aurai 60.
Dans 5 secondes, exactement la composition estimée par la SOFRES de la nouvelle Assemblée nationale de la République française.
June 24th. French TV fanfares its own computerized swingometer. The right got a drubbing, communists were down, socialists had never won such a huge slice of the electoral cake. Mitterrand's party now has an absolute majority. Only General de Gaulle ever had that kind of parliamentary backing. De Gaulle lived in the palace. Giscard sometimes slept there. Mitterrand turns up every morning, commuting from his house on the left bank. Overlooking the Élysée Park, Mitterrand, unlike Giscard, chooses to work in the office once occupied by the general. Some suggest de Gaulle's most persistent opponent may turn out to be, in manner at least, the most Gaullist of our presidents since the general himself. Has Mitterrand got around him people who will tell him the truth and the whole truth?
I hope so, anyway. Otherwise, he might submit himself to the same fate as Giscard did. Giscard, around him, hadn't got many people who told him the truth, and besides, he wouldn't listen. So far as Mitterrand is concerned, it may be different, because, for example, he doesn't live in the Élysée. He likes to meet friends, he likes to see what happens outside.
Will he have courtiers, or will he have advisors?
He has courtiers.
Will they become advisors?
And he has advisors. The problem is, let's hope that the advisors won't become courtiers. I take it the other way around.
Next to the president's office, from a room which sieves all official visitors, operates Jacques Attali, special advisor. To his friends, a brilliant economist who's also written books on music and medicine. To his critics, someone who often gets carried away by words.
I've met him 13 years ago, and I may say I've never been able to understand any kind of change in his line from that time. He's a very clear man, very open. And
not at all mysterious?
No, not mysterious, he's secret. Mm-hmm. He knows and he says very often that the only way to keep a secret is not to say it to anyone. Mm-hmm. Then he's secret, but not mysterious. He's very clear, and he is prepared to do exactly what he says. He thinks that pragmatically we can change a lot and give more power. We want his understanding of socialism would be summed up usually in those two lines. One, to give to people more space of freedom in the already conceptualized spaces of freedom. And secondly, open the imagination to new spaces of freedom. Not to give them already, but to give people the right of thinking that it's possible to conquer them in the next decade and perhaps century.
In this decade, Mitterrand is also trying to open up the Élysée. The 14th of July garden party had never had such a guest list.
Attention, laissez quand même les Africains, les anciens combattants d'Afrique, alors. Eh bien oui, je comprends bien, mais
Mitterrand is as conscious as Giscard of the dignity of his office, but he's cautiously feeling his way towards a relaxed presidential style without too many innovations. He's done away at home with morning coats, but he's not going to appear at official functions without a tie. Face to face or in a crowd, How can a president of the Republic really keep in touch with ordinary citizens? The problem puzzles the president's entourage.
Nous arrivons là tôt le matin, et le président de la République arrive là tôt le matin.
We arrive early in the morning, we leave late at night. We have visitors, people come and see us. But we don't go out and visit other people. And that's why, from time to time, we plan to leave the Élysée. I do it whenever I can. I've held meetings. I've already visited several towns to meet fellow citizens and talk with them. We're a bit cut off.
Isn't that one of the hazards of being president?
I think it is one of the hazards of being president, or any public figure, and we have to guard against it.
It's to his relatively modest country house of Latch in the southwest that Mitterand regularly retires to meditate and write, or to care for his donkeys and his bees.
Qu'est-ce qui vaut votre miel?
Très bon. C'est du miel de bruyère, d'acacia, de houx, de genêt. C'est très bon miel. C'est beau à voir, hein?
The president is very proud of the trees he's planted. Indirectly, he points out that he keeps in touch with peasant common sense. He entertains visitors with learned lectures on oaks and pines and the infinite wonders and inequalities of nature. Allusions to rural France are very abundant in his chiseled writings.
Qui est un ancien terrain marécageux, c'est trop bas et les racines des chênes rencontrent tout de suite la couche d'eau qui, en hiver.
In the first 100 days, Latch is already becoming the new Colombey-les-Deux-Églises. It's a resting place for the president and a place of pilgrimage for the very privileged guests.
Vous avez plus de pouvoir, probablement, que n'importe quel...
You really have more power than any of the presidents of the Fifth Republic, including General de Gaulle.
Pouvoir institutionnel, non. More institutional power, no. It just happens, in this case, that I was elected President of the Republic after many years in opposition.
Un long passage dans l'opposition, je suis le premier président de la République.
I'm first President of the Fifth Republic, at any rate elected by universal suffrage, to come from the ranks of the opposition, which means having deep roots in the life of the people.
Une sorte d'enracinement très profond dans une réalité populaire. Ou bien j'ai accumulé...
Either I've accumulated during my life my struggles, what we could simply call experience. Either I've accumulated enough reserves to establish, to use a fashionable expression I don't care for, my relationship to power, and to know how to stay within the limits of the power I've been granted, in full critical awareness of my own behavior. Either I say I've built up these reserves, or nothing, for me as for anyone else, will shield me from the temptations of power. So it's a matter of whether I'm lucky enough or strong enough to stay within the required limits of democracy.
Rester dans les limites exigibles dans une démocratie. C'est au fond.
In the end, it's all I've lived through in 35 years of politics, particularly during my 23 years in opposition.
J'ai si souvent ressenti profondément.
I've so deeply resented the mistakes of uncontrolled power that I'd have to lose all sense of myself if, in power, I forgot my thoughts on the subject. It hasn't happened yet, believe me.
Ce n'est pas encore arrivé, croyez-moi.
Socialist or not, France sticks to its traditional military parades. The 14th of July ceremonies were naturally presided over by Mitterand, chief of the French armed forces. Unlike Great Britain, France has its own independent deterrent with a full panoply of nuclear weapons. Nowadays, French socialists have fully accepted this Gaullist heritage. For 90% of them, anti-militarism, pacifism and neutralism are as dead as dodos. Deep down under the Élysée, the main presidential military headquarters. From here, from the so-called Jupiter HQ, independently, Mitterand could unleash nuclear thunder, the famous force de frappe.
Ici l'Élysée, j'appelle le centre d'opération de la défense aérienne. Comment me recevez-vous maintenant?
Je vous reçois 5 sur 5, mon général.
Image comprise?
Image comprise, mon général.
J'appelle maintenant le centre d'opération des forces aériennes stratégiques.
Le centre opérationnel des forces aériennes stratégiques reçoit l'Élysée, son image 5-5, mon général.
Parfait, je vous remercie. J'appelle maintenant le centre d'opération des armées.
Centre opération des armées, je vous reçois 5-5, image et son.
Très bien, je vous reçois également 5-5. Merci.
Did President Mitterrand come here as soon as he took over?
Dès son installation, le président a tenu.
As soon as he took over, the president was keen to visit the Jupiter command post and have its workings explained to him, especially his communication links with the armed forces.
And did he try them out?
Absolument, il a pris contact.
Certainly, he was in contact with his force commanders directly from Jupiter.
And did President Giscard d'Estaing do the same thing?
Absolument.
Certainly, though when President Giscard d'Estaing came, it wasn't as well equipped.
Since President Mitterrand has a literary rather than a military turn of mind, would you say he had any difficulty learning the technical procedures?
Je ne voudrais pas faire un mauvais jeu.
Well, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I can assure you that President Mitterrand had no problems.
Je pense qu'il n'y a aucun problème là-dessus.
Does he come here often?
Je ne peux pas.
I can't answer that.
Military secret?
Secret d'État.
Quel sentiment avez-vous éprouvé lorsque vous êtes descendu?
What were your feelings when you went down into the Jupiter command post at the Élysée? Does it worry you that one man has such powers of destruction?
J'ai demandé lorsque j'étais dans les positions.
I suggested, when I was in the opposition, and I think I was right to do so, that the president shouldn't be the only one to make the decision.
Bon, certes, la décision ultime.
Oh, of course, the final decision can only be made by one man. But before that point was reached, I wanted the head of the General Staff, and the Prime Minister especially, to be able to get together to consider all the elements of the problem. An enormous problem, as you can imagine, atomic war or not.
Guerre ou pas guerre atomique. Et s'il n'y a pas guerre atomique.
And if there isn't an atomic war, the risk a country takes of being overrun and occupied.
Donc, je pense.
So I think to involve more people in the decision would be useful.
Quant à l'ultime décision,
as for the final decision of yes or no, the fatal act, only the president can do that. That's how it is. It's not theoretical, it's fact.
Have you often thought about it?
Yes, I think about it, but we mustn't over-dramatize things. At the present moment, I don't think there are any world leaders mad enough to risk atomic war.
Mais il faut que le monde entier connaisse la résolution du président.
But the whole world should know that while the President of France would go to every possible length to keep the peace, he is also fully aware of his responsibility for life or death, for peace or war.
Ces responsabilités qui sont celles de la vie ou de la mort, de la paix ou de la guerre.
La parole est à Monsieur le Premier ministre.
In the National Assembly in July, Mauroy delivers the long-awaited Queen's speech. How tough, how doctrinaire would the government's program be? On Mitterrand's instructions, the Prime Minister was pretty radical, especially on nationalization.
Conformément aux engagements du Président de la République, 11 groupes industriels viendront pendant la législature s'insérer au sein du secteur public. 11 groupes. Pas un de plus, pas un de moins, c'est là notre engagement. La nationalisation sera immédiate pour le groupe Dassault, qui vit pour l'essentiel de commandes militaires.
On the Gaullist benches, Marcel Dassault, head of the Dassault Empire, takes the news calmly. But why was the president in such a hurry over nationalizations?
I must point out, it's those who are now complaining most about our haste, even though everything was announced in advance, who used to accuse me of being woolly. Well, I hope they're satisfied now. I'm not as woolly as all that. But if they'd listened more carefully during the presidential campaign, they'd have heard about the things my government is doing now. Why so fast? Why do everything at such a speed? We've done it at the beginning of our term of office. There are practical reasons for that. If we don't do it now, we'll never do it. Pressure of work. Events always bearing down on you, hounding you. The distractions of daily politics. Every few months, fresh problems to be faced. But we'll do what we've promised. So the nationalizations will take place about the end of this year.
We are not against nationalization for ideological reasons, but for economic reasons. Now we think that nationalization don't work. In the French situation now, we need more liberty, less control of the government on the economy, on the enterprise, and not more control like in nationalization.
The socialists often say that they're simply completing General de Gaulle's grand design.
It was not the same thing. After the war, we have to rebuild France. And to rebuild France and French economy, it was necessary to nationalize some key sectors of the French economy.
The socialists today say that they have to nationalize other key sectors.
They are not key sectors. They are not key sectors. In the world today, which is very different from the world 30 years ago, 35 years ago, they are not today key sectors, and they are not monopoly. They are...
No monopolies.
No monopolies. I think they are not monopolies. And I think the nationalization could be a sort of handicap for this industry. That's very worrying for us.
Je ne vous cacherai pas que les premiers échanges entre la majorité et l'opposition au sein de la nouvelle Assemblée nous ont guère satisfaits. Le gouvernement, comme je vous comprends, c'est dur d'être dans l'opposition, mais permettez, nous l'avons été 23 ans.
En ce qui concerne le Premier ministre...
Why did you choose Pierre Mauroy, and do you propose to keep him 2, 5 or 7 years?
I haven't planned anything. I appointed Pierre Mauroy because he's a capable man I've worked with for a long time. I've got confidence in him. There wasn't anyone else better suited to the job. Others could have done it, of course, but you know in politics it's a question of the right man at the right time. That's what Pierre Mauroy was.
C'était le cas de Pierre Mauroy. Combien de temps?
For how long? Well, it's understood between a president and a prime minister of the Fifth Republic that the prime minister must stand aside the day it's necessary. But if it's not necessary, if he lasts the 7 years, all to the good. But it hasn't happened yet.
Ça ne s'est pas encore produit, en tout cas.
Very often foreigners, and sometimes the French, aren't clear about how the President of the Republic and the Prime Minister share the work. How do you see these two jobs?
I let the Prime Minister handle all the daily problems himself, and even some of the important problems I feel fall within his scope. I deal with what you might call the main guidelines.
Has Mauroy got a very strong personality, or will he simply be the yes man to all Mitterrand's desire? And won't they inevitably clash, as most French prime ministers clashed with the president at one point or the other?
I don't believe it. There won't be a clash between Mauroy and Mitterrand. I don't believe it at all. He won't be a yes man because he never was a yes man to Mitterrand. Remember that inside, in the Socialist Party, he belonged to a different tendency, and he led it, as a matter of fact. He led a group which was not a pro-Mitterrand group. He was never a yes man, and he won't be a yes man. At the same time, he might be a very useful advisor.
Every Wednesday morning, the President chairs the cabinet meeting at the Élysée. All factions of the Socialist Party, from Rocard's moderates to Chevènement's leftists, were satisfied or silenced with ministries. So neither the Prime Minister nor the President has to bother about internal party bickerings, at least for the moment. It was the ministries handed out to non-socialists that caused all the fuss.
BBC World Service. The news read by Pamela Crichton. 4 communists have been included in the new French government. The first time the party has won government posts for 34 years.
Charles Fitterman, supposedly the number 2 man in the French Politburo, was appointed Minister of Transport. To give him an added dash of prestige, he was also made a Minister of State. He's a courteous but rigorous Stalinist. A curious ballet followed Fitterman's appointment. As he left the Élysée through the front door, a slightly horrified visitor came in through another.
Our European allies are sovereign nations, and the decision on how they are governed rests with their citizens and with their elected representatives. However, the position of the United States on the subject of communist participation in the governments of our allies is well known. This participation is bound to cause concern, but having said that, I do want to emphasize at the conclusion of these remarks that the talks were warm.
A lot of people, especially in America and in Great Britain, were, to put it mildly, somewhat puzzled to see communists in the second ministry of the 4th president of the 5th Republic. Now, how does Mitterrand, according to you, feel deep down about communism, international communism, and about French communists?
That they are member of society, member of French society, they are French citizens, and they have to be associated to the power. That the only way to have it more relevant, more organized in terms of a national conception of the future is to have them linked to the power. Second, he thinks that the only way to have more tame the Communist Party would be to have him weakened. And if you look at his own strategy from the beginning of his political life, it has always been in terms of weakening the Communist Party by an alliance with the Communist Party. And second, that we do not want, and it would be a stupid thing to weaken the Communist Party too much. And it's his opinion too. Very important, because we do not want, and his main, I would say, obsession is not to let the country go towards too much lack of channelization of the impulse of violence within the youth. And the Communist Party, as a radical party, in the real sense of radical, is really a good way, a democratic way of channelizing radical impulse of the youth. Better than any kind of terrorism, which is already exploding throughout Europe.
He's made the Communist Party much weaker, and he thinks, rightly or wrongly, I'm not quite sure he's right, that he's made them weak enough to include them into the government without running the risk of having to yield to their demands.
He is silencing them that way?
That's what he believes.
What do you believe?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It might be dangerous if our foreign friends, or English friends, for example, or American friends, or German friends, or allies in Europe and outside Europe, believe that this is going to make the European ties and the Atlantic ties looser.
But on the home front, in France, isn't there a danger of the communists infiltrating the ministries in which they are and then spreading? Isn't that a very well-known communist tactic?
There is.
For instance, Monsieur Mitterand is Minister of State and Minister of Transport, and there's been a good deal of waffling about whether he was entitled to see the mobilization plans and transportation plans in case of war. How do you really feel about that?
Well, the way the government reacted to that showed that by including the communists in his government, Mitterand took a very, very high risk.
Au moment de votre nomination, il y a eu le problème. When you were appointed, the problem about the defense secrets that you were supposed to have access to came up. People said you had complete control of transport plans in the event of mobilization. Frankly, what people implied was that a communist couldn't be loyal. That's what they roughly meant. Have you really got these famous mobilization plans?
One of my responsibilities is the organization of transport for defense. As for the previous transport minister, nothing has changed.
Do you have a lot of defense secrets?
We really must try and be serious about this. I'm not the Minister of Defense, but I do have the same responsibilities as my predecessor. I've already pointed out that I'm not prepared to be questioned about my loyalty to France and the interests of our country.
Ma loyauté à l'égard de la France et à l'égard de l'intérêt de notre pays, je considère toute...
I consider any imputation to that effect to be an insult.
À cet égard comme une insulte. Je ne l'accepte pas.
I just won't accept it. I'm a Frenchman through and through, a minister through and through, and I shall defend, as I've always defended, the interests of the workers of this country and of France herself.
De ce pays et les intérêts de la France elle-même.
You don't think that for a communist minister, there is nevertheless a certain conflict between your loyalty to communism in general and to France and this government in particular?
Non, cela ne veut rien.
I don't think anything of the sort. The policy of the French Communist Party is totally dedicated to satisfying the needs and aspirations of the workers and the people of this country.
Des aspirations des travailleurs et du peuple de ce pays vers le
plus the economic advancement of France and international cooperation, especially within the common market and neighboring countries. It's a policy which takes France's international commitments into account and endorses the need to respect them, while ensuring that France's international role corresponds to her intentions and capabilities. Those are the outlines of our party's policies and how I approach things. So, in this area, there can't possibly be any problem.
What do you think of those who say Mitterand has included communists in his government so as to get industrial peace, as the Communist Party and the CGT Union have a very good relationship with each other?
I've always believed in doing my job and letting others say what they like. They say anything. Well, let them. Social peace, what does that mean?
It means no strikes.
If we want this country to progress without hitches in a positive way, I've never been in favor of strikes for strike's sake. If workers go on strike, they don't do it for fun. So, if we want things to progress, we have to solve the problems.
Often unfairly, Socialist ministers and militants have vociferously denounced the preceding 7 years of what they would no doubt call Giscardian misrule. For some time in northern France, textile works have suffered, mainly from fierce international competition, closing down one after another.
Depuis le deuxième tour des élections, le patronat est lancé dans un troisième tour qui est un troisième tour économique. Encore hier, dans le bâtiment, nous avons eu des licenciements dans l'entreprise Coignet. 160 camarades sont menacés d'être licenciés ici dans le Nord-Pas-de-Calais. Aux aciéries de Paris-Outreau, il y a aussi des menaces de licenciement très importantes qui ont été données ces derniers jours.
Ce que nous voulons, ce que nous attendons...
What we want is a different policy from the one they had before, which led to inflation and unemployment.
Je pense que tout en restant dans du...
We don't want to be unreasonable,
Tout ce que nous n'avons pas eu jusqu'à présent...
but they haven't done anything so far. That's why the textile workers are demonstrating.
Syndicale qui touche le textile, disons également une meilleure prise en compte des...
We want them to listen to the unions more, so as we can find a solution.
À des solutions. La crise existe, mais il y a sûrement des solutions...
The crisis exists, so there has to be a way out. And I think a left-wing government ought to find the solution.
Trouver ces solutions, c'est ce que l'on souhaite, quoi. Et vous, madame?
We hope President Mitterand will do something for the whole group because we're really in a nasty situation. We just don't know what's going to happen. We all go on holiday tomorrow. We don't know if we'll get our holiday money. We're due back at the end of August, but we don't even know if the factory will be open.
Unions in France are less powerful than in Great Britain, so they can't bring as much pressure on the government. This didn't prevent ministers, as they walked out of the Élysée this summer, from occasionally bumping into small genial demos. The Minister for National Solidarity feels the challenges are formidable.
We're very worried about how we're governing, how we're going to succeed. I mean, I don't know, even we ourselves have not realized, and I mean, I'm quite sure even you yourself, how extraordinary this socialist majority is in the French political scene. Our real problem is whether we'll be up to the situation. It's not really what's going to happen in the traditional field of French politics. It is whether this government is really going to be up to the mark, that it have enough imagination, be able to carry this country out of the crisis, be able to find an answer to unemployment. That's what the people are expecting of us.
Une moitié, donc sur 60, là, ça ferait une moitié question de principe. Pour l'assurance maladie, on en a 14 rien que sur les délais de paiement, et on va mettre 3 mois ou 6 mois à répondre.
The Minister for National Solidarity holds her regular staff meeting.
Des fonctionnaires. Alors, on n'avait pas d'opinion là-dessus. Bah, effectivement, c'est entre le boss Yvette Roudy, mais nous, quand même, on peut avoir une opinion, on peut dire quelque chose.
Like most socialist ministers, Questure works with an inner circle of party militants and high civil servants. This new ministry, with its generous lyrical title, also covers welfare, social security and immigration.
The Prime Minister told me that I was entitled to speak of social justice. I can give my opinion on activities of other ministers if I believe solidarity is concerned.
Have you meddled in other people's affairs yet?
Yes, I have meddled in other people's affairs.
For instance?
Well, I will. For instance, I have. The first thing we did in this ministry in the first 3 weeks was to gather all the statistics we could find on inequality in France. But we didn't refer only to social transfers. We looked right into working conditions, education, I mean, everything. And I have made a sort of, I called it a tableau de la solidarité, which I'm going to send to all my fellow ministers.
What kind of style are you trying to put on your ministry?
Well, I think politics should be much more simple. And also, we do refer to the Republican tradition.
What does that entail?
This may be slightly contradictory. For instance, I have a car with a chauffeur and even a policeman. However,
in the car?
However, I do not use it on weekends. I come with my own car if I have to work here. I also have been immediately gone right through this ministry and seen practically everybody. Now, they told me that some of these people had never seen the minister actually in their office.
How many people do you have here in the ministry?
Oh, several thousand.
Yeah, how can you say that you've seen several thousand people?
Well, because
you just walk through the offices.
I just walk through. But even that.
You think that the symbolism of it is enough?
I don't think it's enough. I think the symbolism is useful. But that's all I mean. We also are told that we are busy and economical. We do not want to be a flashy government. We're told to be, and I mean, we expect to be extremely sort of discreet in the way we use certain forms and advantages of power.
Was it absolutely necessary to have a new ministry?
Yes, I think it was absolutely necessary because we were moving out of a period where the right-hand governments had slowly discredited social security and social affairs. Things were always dealt with in financial terms, or if anything was to be done, it was done under a sort of color of charity. We were always doing things for les plus défavorisés. Now, to be quite frank, something like what's happening to your health service, when we speak of solidarity, we want to move back to the ideas of the Second World War. I mean, for instance, the beverage plan, social security. Well, in the 80s, Solidarité Nationale. It means that we want a strong movement carried by the people in favor of their social security system.
But why would the socialists do better than their predecessors, apart from, having perhaps better intentions?
I think we'll do better because first we will decentralize and we will get people interested in the system again. We will allow them to take part in what is decided. We'll also do better because we will be frank.
The socialists suggest that there is going to be more cooperation between the powers that be and the people. Do you think the people are going to get it?
I'm not sure, because I think the socialist government and the socialist party is rather a classical party, and the power in the socialist party and in the government, in the socialist government, will be, I think, concentrated between a few hands, Mitterand and the Prime Minister, and just half a dozen of high officials of the Socialist Party.
But concentration of power in the hands of the president is a Gaullist invention.
Yeah, but I think that one of the reasons of the change is that the people ask for more cooperation and more dialogue between people and government, and I think for less concentration of the power.
And now you feel the socialists have got everything.
I think it would be a sort of totalitarian power.
Totalitarian?
Yeah, because
don't you think that the socialists are deep down Democrats?
Totalitarian in the very sense of the word. Socialist power from the head of the presidency to the bottom of the enterprise.
What you mean is total power?
Yeah, but total could become totalitarian.
It could also be democratic.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Bonsoir. Eh bien, cette fois, les dés sont jetés. Le grand...
The three French TV channels have always been controlled by whatever government happened to be in power. Television was the plum of an unofficial spoils system. Employees of French television and radio inside, and most socialists outside, clamored for independent broadcasting. You can't keep the same people at the top, said the Minister of Communication. You're witch hunting, replied his critics. In less than 100 days, the summer clear-out was over. Jean-Louis Guillot, head of Channel 1, forced out. Maurice Ulrich, head of Channel 2, forced out. Claude Contamine, head of Channel 3, forced out. Michel Bassi, head of Radio Monte Carlo, refused to go and was sacked. Struggling all the way, Jacqueline Baudrier, head of the state radio, was finally kicked sideways to the exalted post of ambassador to UNESCO.
La direction de l'information confirme sa volonté d'engager une réforme approfondie pour améliorer l'efficacité.
Journalists conclaved in a subdued May 1968 mood. The Minister for Communication promised a new law. It would cut the umbilical cord linking broadcasting and the government. TV journalists, the bright, the beautiful, and the mediocre, exchanged views through account settling and soul-searching sessions.
Il est vrai que Cavada, en arrivant, a été une attitude plutôt arrogante et suffisante, qu'il n'a pas reçu les gens qu'il avait promis de recevoir. Tout ceci est vrai. Mais nous aussi, nous n'avons pas osé dire ce que nous disons aujourd'hui avant la victoire des socialistes. Nous n'avons pas osé. Nous sommes lâches aussi.
Alors je propose que l'on vote pour savoir si l'on est d'accord que ces gens, c'est-à-dire rédaction en chef, directeur de l'information, etc., enfin les leviers de commande, au moins jusqu'au rédacteur en chef, démissionnent d'eux-mêmes. Je veux dire, c'est pas on va pas tourner autour du pot pendant. On va pas faire réunion sur réunion. Alors que c'est le but.
Une interprétation là.
Non, moi c'est mon sentiment.
C'est le tien, mais ici tu es pas le seul.
Non, mais d'accord, mais justement, je demande qu'on vote là-dessus. Je demande qu'on vote là-dessus. Et je pense que c'est pour nous vital, parce que demain, si nous n'avons pas su prendre nous-mêmes nos décisions, on les prendra pour nous et on continuera à avoir des gens imposés.
What do you, as journalists, want for French television?
Oh, we want to be free, that's the first thing. And, you know, before we were not free for the choice of the information and for the choice of the way of the information.
The way of presenting news?
Yes, of presenting, and to choose what report to do and what thing to put inside of the report.
And not only information, but TV in all his aspects. TV, this is not only news. This is also creation, this is theater, this is games, and so on. And I think this is the most important problem now.
Do you trust this government to set French television free?
We trust more than the precedent government. But we are a little bit anxious because socialists and radicals and communists were in the opposition 23 years. And we are a little afraid because they don't know how to run affairs. But we trust them, but we are a little suspicious.
Up to now, no French government has allowed television to be independent. Why would your government be so much more successful?
Why not? Unbiased television, or rather unbiased journalists, that's impossible. That would devitalize them, reduce them to nothing. A journalist must be what he is. It's the institution that has to be protected. Inside it, there must be a broad variety of opinion so that the journalists can be themselves, but with more concern than some have had in the past for their professional code. Good professional standards, plus a respect for others with strong personal convictions, make a good journalist. And if he works inside an institution which guarantees his professional independence, why shouldn't that work? So it's this idea of a broad range of opinions that must be guaranteed by the new institutions. TV channels and radio stations must stop being under the direct control of the head of state or government.
Are you solemnly promising to be radically different in this respect from your predecessors?
I don't need to promise anything, it's what I believe.
Socialist ideology quickly had to face the very immediate and practical questions of arms sales. What should the government do about its weapons industry, probably the third biggest in the world? It spurs research, it provides jobs for civilians, and sophisticated equipment for the French armed forces. A few weeks after Mitterand became president, the Satory military fair was in full swing. One of the latest products, amphibious inflatable canoe, great choice of assorted machine guns. To seduce prospective buyers, weapons at Satory are presented in realistic settings. France has the not totally unjustified reputation of flogging arms all over the world. Socialists would like to be more scrupulous and selective in the future. But who is and who isn't acceptable, morally and politically, as a buyer?
Il possède une mécanique fiable, robuste, de haute performance, simple et éprouvée. Il coordonne à tous les véhicules de la famille et leur assure des performances similaires.
Some socialists, generally outside government, are suggesting that you could transform a lot of factories, arms factories, into civilian factories, so to speak.
Well, in our case, it would be rather difficult because the export of this kind of vehicle is only a small part of our activity. Our main activity is being governed by the French military needs. We couldn't close anyhow.
Some people establish a difference between offensive and defensive weapons. What do you think of this distinction?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but it's always very difficult. I can speak only on my activity. All the vehicles are strictly in this way, defensive. But they may be offensive in another way. That's according to the use you want to do with them.
Some people also say that there's a great difference between selling small arms, that's a dirty kind of racket, and selling big arms, big weapons, that's clean.
Well, clean or dirty. This is something, either you are working with governments or you are not working with governments. As soon as it's for military use of a country, it should be clean, because that's a defense problem. And there's nothing dirty about small or big weapons in this case.
Do you think one can moralize about the sale of weapons?
Moralize you can always. If you have problems, if you think the country you are selling to may use it for other purposes than its own defense. And it happened in the past. For example, we moralized the sales to Portugal years ago because of
Before
Angola.
the new republic?
Yes, before, because of Angola. And we said that this kind of weapon had not to be used for colonies. But it's very hard to make always the right distinction.
Is it possible to have moral attitudes about the sale of arms when between 300 and 500,000 jobs depend on them?
I see what you mean about moral attitudes, but I don't want jobs to be lost. I'd only refuse permission for certain contracts when I was sure that the arms factories could be converted to civil production. It's my job to ensure the continuity of French life. I can't rewrite history as if good and evil hadn't existed. At the same time, it's conceivable that the sale of such things as light armored cars, for example, to a head of state who might want to machine gun his people with them, could well be stopped.
If you converted part of the armaments industry to civilian purposes, doesn't France risk falling behind in research and endangering her military independence?
Et aussi d'aliéner son indépendance dans le domaine militaire.
I'd like to be very clear about this. It's true that the export of arms helps with the export of civil goods. It's true that the French army couldn't have the sophisticated weapons it possesses today if there was only the limited national market, and if there wasn't the possibility of manufacturing and selling similar equipment abroad. I mean that the French army equipment wouldn't be so modern if our armaments industry only had to supply the French army. The market wouldn't be big enough. It's also true that if you get out of the arms business, someone else will take your place. And in the end, America, Russia, and others will replace us. Which won't stop certain countries getting hold of the arms they want. All these problems of realism and self-interest, that's what we're facing. But we shouldn't approach these problems from an absolutist point of view, and they can always be modified. The contract signed by France, even those I disapprove of, will be honored, because France has given her word.
The government was soon tested on arms contracts and the importance of missile boats in diplomacy. Years ago, France had signed a contract with the Shah of Iran for 3 of them. This summer, they were on their way to joining the Ayatollah Khomeini's navy. One suddenly disappeared. It had been hijacked by Shah supporters. Unspotted, it went through the Straits of Gibraltar. It turned up off the coast of France, cruising between Toulon and Marseille. After very complicated negotiations, the hijackers finally gave themselves up. They were taken aboard French ships. The missile carrier was gently forwarded to the Ayatollah. Within hours, the hijackers had been granted political asylum by the French government, and they weren't the only ones. Ex-President Bani Sadr, escaping from Iran, was taken in as well. Under President Giscard, France's record for political refugees from Chile to Vietnam was really excellent. It still is under Mitterand, who wants to have a firm but original human rights policy with particular insistence on the Third World. So Bani Sadr, although he holds more press conferences than political exiles are really entitled to even in France, stays. Some Americans accuse French socialists of sometimes indulging in a rather naive third worldism, ignoring that many third world countries are totalitarian, whether of the right or of the left.
If you consider what's happened since 1917 in Russia since the revolution, you have to ask yourself the question which I asked myself at the beginning of my political life. What has been the most important factor in the arrival of communism and its installation in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere? Is it Lenin or underdevelopment? The sensible answer would be both Lenin and underdevelopment. The fact of being an underdeveloped country makes it difficult to escape from the single-party system, sometimes even from dictatorship and bureaucracy, because far too few of the population are literate or educated in modern skills. And so a small minority group considers it has a duty to act on behalf of the people, often against their will and interests. The truth is that United States policy takes no account of the Third World, which it sees merely as a series of strategic points on a military map. For instance, the United States rapprochement with South Africa, which shows no concern for what's going on in the rest of Black Africa, what conditions are like in Mozambique, Angola, or Namibia, or how people would react on the Ivory Coast or in the Cameroons. They say South Africa is stable, knows how to fight, has managed to defend its plucky white minority, and they don't care how it's done. They're interested in strategic points on the map, and they don't bother about the economic problems.
What image do you have of Great Britain?
First, there's a rich store of personal memories and historical memories inherited from previous generations, all set in a background where there was a great deal of admiration for England. Considered, of course, after Greece as the mother of democracy and as a very advanced civilization, not only in the industrial sense, but in the quality of its customs. I lived in a family where there was respect and love for England. And my own experience has increased this admiration. I was in London in December 1943 and in January and February 1944, during one of the blitzes. One of the heaviest German bombing attacks on London. And I saw what it was to be English. And all that is mixed up with what I feel for them today, a sense of respect.
What kind of relationship can you, one-time First Secretary of the Socialist Party, have with someone like Mrs. Thatcher, poles apart from you politically? What strikes you most about her?
Her energy, her character, her temperament, and a mind that's completely focused on the aims she recognizes as good. I believe her explanation of the world is a long way from mine.
That's an understatement, isn't it?
Well, naturally, I tend to think she's the one who's wrong. But she's English, she functions in England. I'm French, I function in France. And though I might set down my thoughts on paper in an effort to have a better understanding of the course of modern history in England and France, at the present moment, I wouldn't come to any public conclusions. But I'm one of those who believe that everything is possible in modern society as long as you can sustain a social dialogue.
Dialogue social en particulier.
The Ottawa Summit, hosted by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. It gave the media their binge of the year, although hard news was the least available commodity. This gathering of industrial nations actually took place at Montebello, the biggest log cabin in the world, they said. The Canadians provided the minimum required amount of picturesqueness and the maximum amount of security. It was the setting for President Mitterrand's first performance on the world stage. Mitterrand and Trudeau both wanted more emphasis on relations with the poorer countries, the so-called North-South dialogue. But how far could they take the others along with them? Some commentators had foreseen bitter exchanges with President Reagan, for he seemed more concerned with big power politics, the so-called East-West approach. But in the event, cameras recorded mainly platitudes and pleasantries.
Mr. President. Hello there. Happy to see you. Happy to see you. You said hello in my language, bonjour.
Vous m'avez dit bonjour dans ma langue.
Absolument. Mr. President, I had the great privilege to be received by you in Washington. Yes, recently, certainly did. It was a great pleasure for us. Well, I only had a couple of years of schoolboy French.
many, many years ago. So I don't think I can do as well as you can in your language.
Right. Je pense qu'il est inévitable de faire.
Good morning, madam.
Sleep here.
Good morning, Chancellor. Good morning. Nice to see you. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning.
I'm so sorry. I didn't see you.
It's a nice room.
Well, we're deskmates. It's pretty good.
Well, good morning. While the press is taking...
On the main economic front, the French were determined to speak their minds about American financial policy. Privately, the American philosophy was, we upped our interest rates, up yours. But in fact, no one made a serious concession.
12 o'clock noon, we did agree last night.
A facade of agreement was put up for the benefit of the press and of public opinion. And at the end of the conference, each head of delegation gave a potted resume of his position.
I'll get you over here. Yes. I guess you've paid to 4 houses of net, Mr. President. Mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais tout d'abord, au nom de mes collègues à cette table, souhaiter la plus cordiale des bienvenues à la presse ici assemblée.
The true measure of these past 2 days, days filled with candid but always friendly talks, is that we leave with a true sense of common understanding and common purpose.
We were agreed on the need to fight inflation as the precondition for defeating unemployment, as you have emphasized, Mr. Chairman, and on the need for low monetary growth, on the need for containing public borrowing, and for tight control of government expenditure.
Vous savez tous que la France conduit, pour ce qui la concerne, une politique originale. Enfin, originale, ici, par rapport au thème généralement proposé.
How did François Mitterrand come over at the Ottawa Summit?
I would say as second best. I think he was the leader of the Europeans. He put the European case more strongly and more generally than anybody else. He was the one who made the European case on North-South, made the European case and forced the Americans to give a little bit on East-West, and was the one who pronounced what were the key words about interest rates in saying that we're at the threshold of what's tolerable and we'll wait and see until the end of the year.
How would you say he's perceived by the average American?
We have no point of reference for Mitterrand. He's someone very, very remote, distant, hard for us to understand. He's not in any way like any of his predecessors. We knew what a snob was like, and we could imagine Giscard. We knew what a banker was like, and we could imagine Pompidou. De Gaulle was for us a kind of Baroque cathedral, but a figure, an impressive figure, a little bit outré perhaps. And maybe a little bit out of the past, but still a massive, splendid figure. But for Mitterrand, we have no stereotypes in our experience. We don't know what he's all about when he talks about French literature. We don't know much about what he's about when he talks about nature. His rapport with nature is very different than that of an American suburbanite, for example. And I think he's someone not easy for Americans to grasp at all.
What about his socialism? In Europe, and in France especially, people often think that Americans equate a socialist and a communist.
Well, look, you know, ordinary Americans are not going to respond to Monsieur Mitterrand, and he really slips below the level of the average consciousness. Professionals who pay attention to socialism and communism, I think, on the contrary, in the United States are quite well aware that, as General Haig once put it to me, the socialists, the French socialists, have been in the streets fighting the communists. We're going to get a much tougher stance vis-a-vis the Communist Party in France and vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, this is Haig speaking, from Mitterrand than we ever got from Giscard d'Estaing. So I think the people that care don't have that problem about socialists and communists.
Some people in France and abroad suggest that Mitterrand is not terribly good at economics or on technical matters. Now, what do American officials who've dealt with him say privately?
They have been surprised at how well informed he is on what they regard as technical details of wage levels, measures of efficiency, productivity, and things like that. And they put that down to Monsieur Attali, who works with him and is very technical. But in general, I think Americans find that Mitterrand, that economics is not his subject. They think that that's going to be one of the areas of real tension. I think Mitterrand is a dedicated socialist, believes in changing the relationship between man and the machine, really is dedicated, it seems to me, to the proposition of trying to go to a 35-hour week. The Americans regard that as pipe dreams. They think that if the French do that, they will just price themselves out of the international market. And then I think there's a lot of American concern, because I don't think there's a hostile feeling toward Mitterrand. I think Americans would like him to succeed, but there really is a lot of concern that there's going to be a breakdown in the French economy, and we think of France in the United States as the middle kingdom, and if France doesn't work, at least I think our view is Europe doesn't work. So there's genuine concern about that, and a feeling that his weak spot is economics.
Up to now, what would you say are the main positive and the main negative characteristics of this socialist government? Be frank.
We are very new. Is that negative? Maybe a little bit negative. Maybe we'll waste time. Maybe we might be a bit untidy. Maybe we could think that everything is possible and then suddenly realize that some difficulties we hadn't thought of are more difficult than we think.
How long do you think you will have to wait before you can judge fairly?
We have judged fairly.
Before the events, before?
I think we have judged. We have judged the first months of socialist government. Social measure. Without money to pay this social measure. That's, we have judged fairly the socialist government of Mr. Morat and Chesson and Delors.
So at the end of his 100 days, the position of the new president is clear. Heavy criticism is on the home front, not over foreign affairs. With inflation, his main problem is unemployment. He claims he'll stamp it out by 1988, but France is still on her way to 2 million jobless. Mitterrand also faces the unquantifiable problem of any president. How can he keep in touch with the people?
I haven't really solved that problem yet. There are several places in France where I've lived, spent my life. So I know people there, and the barriers are down between us. At least I think so, since I've got to find out if that's still the case. In the Nièvre, Morvan, Château-Chinon, and other places. There's the place I come from, Charente, and here where I am now. Around here, in the neighboring farms, the little villages, there are people I can sit down with at table. They'll invite me to lunch, to dinner, spend the evening with them, and forget I'm the President of the Republic. Anyhow, I'll soon forget it, and I think I can make them forget it. If I don't maintain these points of anchorage, I don't see where I could meet men and women in France who could act as if I wasn't the President of the Republic. So it's absolutely vital I set aside enough time in my life to go there and refresh myself. Go and spend a day in Château-Chinon, meet people I've known all my life, people who talk straight, who would even get a slight pleasure out of telling me, oh no, that isn't on, that's what I need.
Bien, Julie.